You already know the smell. That warm kitchen air on a Sunday afternoon, a pot going low and slow on the stove, the whole house pulled toward one room by the promise of a real meal. You grew up on the edge of that memory, or you heard about it, and something in you knows it mattered more than we admitted. Here is the truth I finally accepted. A family in 1933 fed 6 people on a Sunday supper that cost less than a single fast food meal costs you today. They did it every week, and they were healthier for it. That knowledge did not vanish by accident. It was set aside, quietly, while somebody else got rich off our forgetting. Before this is over, I am going to hand you a method from an Atlanta newspaper argument in 1931, one that turned kitchen garbage into the most nourishing part of the meal. I still remember my grandmother standing at her enamel stove in a little rented house in southern Ohio, tasting from a wooden spoon, telling me not to pour a single drop down the drain. I ignored her for 40 years. I was wrong. And I am going to show you exactly how wrong. In a way you can use in your own kitchen this very weekend, even if all you have is a hot plate and $12. Let me start with the thing almost nobody understands anymore. The Sunday supper was not one meal. It was the beginning of a machine. When my grandmother bought a chicken, or when the neighbors down her road did the same, that bird was never just Sunday dinner. It was the anchor of an entire week of eating, planned backward from the moment it came into the house. On Sunday you roasted it, and everybody got a piece of real meat, the good meal, the one you dressed up for. But the second that meal ended, the bird went back to work. The carcass, the bones, the skin, the bits nobody finished, all of it went into a pot with cold water and got set on the back of the stove. I want you to understand how deliberate this was. In 1933, at the very bottom of the Depression, the average American family was spending around a third of everything they earned just on food, and millions had almost nothing coming in at all. Unemployment hit nearly 1 in 4 working men. There was no room for waste. None. So a single hen, which might have cost 30 or 40 cents from a farm neighbor, had to carry a family from Sunday to the following Saturday. Monday it became soup from that back-of-the-stove broth, thickened with barley or a handful of rice. Tuesday the last shredded meat went into a pie stretched with potatoes and whatever root vegetables were in the cellar. By Wednesday you were eating the broth again, this time poured over stale bread, and nobody complained, because that broth carried the flavor of the whole week in it. That is the part we lost. Not the recipes, the thinking, the idea that one purchase should keep giving for 7 days. And here is what shocked me when I finally went back and started doing it myself. It works exactly the same today. I bought 1 whole chicken for right around $7. I roasted it on a Sunday, same as she did. My wife and I ate off that single bird, in one form or another, for 5 straight days, and I still had 2 quarts of golden broth left in the refrigerator when it was done. 5 days of meals, $7. I sat at my own kitchen table doing the math and felt something close to shame, because I had spent 4 decades throwing away the most valuable part of every animal I ever cooked. But the chicken was only the beginning, because the real genius of those Sunday suppers was in the dishes that had almost no meat at all. Let me tell you about the meals they built when there was no bird to roast, when even 30 cents was too much. These are the dishes that kept people alive, and every one of them has a name, and most of those names have been buried on purpose. There was one they called the poor man's meal, and it was nothing but a few potatoes diced small, an onion, and a single hot dog, or a bit of any cheap sausage, sliced thin and fried up together in one skillet. That one skillet fed a whole family. The potatoes filled the belly, the onion gave it life, and that one sausage, cut into coins, made it taste like meat all the way through. It cost pennies. People ate it on Sunday and were grateful. There was Hoover stew, and I want you to sit with that name for a second because it tells you everything about how those folks felt. They named it after the president they blamed for their hunger, Herbert Hoover, the man in the White House when the crash came in October of 1929. Hoover stew was macaroni, canned tomatoes, whatever vegetables you could find, and hot dogs sliced in if you were lucky enough to have them. It was the food of the shanty towns they bitterly called Hoovervilles. And here's the thing that gets me. That stew is genuinely good. I have made it. My grandchildren asked for seconds and had no idea they were eating history, eating a meal born out of the worst poverty this country ever knew. Then there was creamed chipped beef on toast, so common that soldiers a few years later gave it a crude nickname I will not say here, but you older folks know exactly the one I mean. A little dried beef, a spoon of flour, some milk stirred into a white gravy, poured hot over toasted bread. It cost almost nothing, and it was hot, filling, and it tasted like something. The whole trick of Depression cooking was gravy. Gravy could turn one strip of bacon into a meal for four. A spoon of fat, a spoon of flour, water, or milk, salt and pepper poured over bread or potatoes or biscuits. That was survival in a skillet. And they did the same magic with desserts, which is where it gets almost unbelievable. They made pies with no fruit in them at all. There was vinegar pie, where a spoonful of apple cider vinegar mixed into a sugar and egg custard fooled the tongue into tasting tart apples. There was water pie, which is exactly what it sounds like. Water, sugar, flour, a little butter and vanilla, baked into a wobbly sweet custard, invented by people who had absolutely nothing sweet in the house and refused to let their children go without a treat on Sunday. And there was mock apple pie, made from crushed crackers, because when apples were too dear, soda crackers boiled with sugar, cinnamon, and lemon somehow came out tasting so close to apple that guests could not tell the difference. Somebody wrote it all down, and then it was allowed to be forgotten. In the 1930s, the United States government itself understood how important this cooking knowledge was, so much so that it put it on the radio, starting in the middle of the 1920s and running strong through the Depression. The Department of Agriculture ran a program with a character named Aunt Sammy. She was meant to be Uncle Sam's wife, a homemaker's voice coming through the radio into kitchens all across the country. Housewives tuned in to hear her recipes and her advice on stretching a food budget. The recipes were so popular that the government printed them up in a booklet, and it became one of the most requested publications they had. Think about that. Our own government once considered teaching people to cook cheap, nourishing food from scratch to be a national mission. I went deeper still, into the Federal Writers Project, part of the Works Progress Administration, where between about 1936 and 1940, out-of-work writers were paid to go and interview ordinary Americans and write down their life stories. Those interviews are real, they are archived, and you can read them today. In them you find people describing exactly what they ate, how they stretched it, what they did when the money ran out. One thread runs through nearly all of it. Nothing was wasted. Fat was saved in a can by the stove. Bones were boiled twice. Bread was never thrown out, it became pudding or thickening for soup. Stale is not spoiled, one of those old voices said, and I have never forgotten it. So the knowledge was written down. It was broadcast on the radio by the government. It survived the war. And then, somewhere in the boom years that followed, it was quietly pushed aside. I lived through the tail end of that. I watched my own mother, who learned all of this at her mother's knee, start buying frozen dinners in the 1960s and feeling proud of it, feeling modern. We were told that cooking from a bone was old-fashioned, that saving fat in a can was something poor people did, something to be ashamed of. And we believed it. I believed it. I spent the best earning years of my life buying my food in boxes and bags, paying somebody else to do what my grandmother did for pennies, and calling it progress. But before I show you who profited from that, I need to stop and talk to the one person watching this who is about to click away. Maybe you are sitting there thinking this is all fine for people with a big kitchen, a garden out back, a deep freezer in the garage, and a Sunday afternoon free to fuss over a stove. Maybe you live in one room. Maybe you have a hot plate, a microwave, a small refrigerator, and you are counting dollars until the end of the month. I want you to hear me clearly, because this next part was built for exactly your situation, and it is the part I am proudest to hand you. You do not need land. You do not need a roast. You do not need special equipment. Here is what you can do this week with almost nothing. Buy 1 bag of dried beans. A pound of dried pinto or navy beans costs a little over $1 in most places and gives you around 6 cups of cooked beans, enough to eat from for days. If you have a pot and any heat source at all, you soak them overnight in water, then simmer them low with an onion and salt. If all you have is that microwave and a bowl, you can still cook them in stages, and people did far more than that with far less. Now here's the trick that makes it a depression meal instead of just plain beans. Ask the butcher counter at any grocery store for a ham bone or a bag of ham hocks. These are some of the cheapest things in the entire store, often just over $1 a pound, sometimes set aside as scraps, because most people today do not know what to do with them. You drop one into that pot of beans. That single bone, with its bits of meat and marrow, flavors the whole pot as if you had bought a pound of ham. $1 of beans, $1 of bone and onion, and you have a pot of rich, protein-packed food that will feed one person for the better part of a week or a small family for a couple of days. That is not desperation. That is genius born from love. And it raises the question that started nagging at me the deeper I dug. If these methods were this clever, this cheap, this effective, why did nobody teach them to my generation? Why did they let all of it slip away? If you have been asking yourself that same question, I want you to know that I spent a long time gathering everything I found into one place, and the result is a digital book called Depression Kitchen, part of the Depression Proof series. It is everything in one collection: the recipes, the methods, the history, the small tricks that kept families fed when there was almost nothing left, written out the way I wish somebody had handed it to me years ago. You can find it linked in the description below, and I think once you have it in your hands, you will understand why I felt it needed to exist. To answer that, I had to go looking in places I never expected, and what I found told me this knowledge did not fade on its own. Add a bag of rice, which runs you almost nothing per serving, and you have beans and rice, a complete protein, a meal that people have survived hard times on for generations across the whole world. I have eaten this in my own kitchen when I was testing whether the old ways truly worked, and I will tell you plainly, a bowl of beans cooked with a smoky ham bone and a little onion over hot rice is better than half the restaurant food I ever paid $20 for, and it cost me under $1 a serving. Add to that a loaf of day-old bread from the discount rack, which stores marked down to almost nothing, and now you have bread for your soup, bread for toast with gravy, and bread that becomes dessert when you tear it up, soak it in a little milk and sugar and cinnamon, and bake it into pudding. One trip to the store, under $15. Days of real, hot, nourishing meals made in the smallest kitchen there is. That is not theory. That is the exact thing those families did, rebuilt for your life right now. So the methods work. They are cheap. They are simple. They kept a whole nation alive through the worst decade it ever faced. Which brings me back to the question that would not leave me alone. If all of this is true, then who benefited from us forgetting it? The answer is not a mystery, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. After the war ended in 1945, this country had built enormous factories to feed and supply an army. And when the soldiers came home, those factories needed something new to make. So they turned to your kitchen. The 1950s and 60s brought a flood of convenience food, boxed dinners, canned everything, frozen meals, powdered mixes, and with all of it came a message repeated in every magazine and every television advertisement. Cooking from scratch is drudgery. A modern woman does not boil a bone all day. A modern family eats food that comes ready-made. And it worked on us completely. We were sold the idea that our grandmother's skills were chains we should be glad to break. Every dollar we handed over for a boxed version of something we used to make for pennies was $1 of profit for somebody, and the profit was enormous because they were selling us back at a huge markup, the very thing we already knew how to do ourselves. The dried beans that cost $1 became a canned, seasoned, 7 times more expensive version on a higher shelf. The broth my grandmother made free from bones became a boxed product with a price tag. The gravy she made from a spoon of drippings became a packet of powder. Here is what makes me angriest, now that I understand it. They did not just sell us convenience. They sold us the forgetting itself. A whole generation grew up not knowing that the bone was the valuable part, not knowing that fat should be saved, not knowing that stale bread is the start of 3 more meals. My own children came up in a house where I had already lost most of it because I had swallowed the story whole. The chain was not broken between my grandmother and me because the knowledge failed. It was broken because a story was more profitable than the truth, and I believed the story, but some people never stopped. Somewhere out in this country there were always families, usually the ones who stayed poor, usually the ones nobody was writing magazine articles about, who kept boiling the bones and saving the fat and pouring nothing down the drain. And it was in tracking down what those families knew that I found the single method I promised you at the start, the one that turns what everybody else throws away into the most nourishing thing on the table. Let me take you back to Atlanta, Georgia, in the winter of 1931. There was an argument that year, printed in the newspapers, that people across the South followed like it was a sporting match. It came to be known as the pot liquor and corn pone debate. On one side was a man who would later become one of the most famous and controversial politicians in the country, Huey Long of Louisiana, and the argument was over the proper way to eat something called pot liquor. Now that sounds like a joke to modern ears. 2 grown men debating in the press over a peasant food, but pay very close attention, because buried inside that silly-sounding argument is one of the most valuable pieces of food knowledge this country ever nearly lost. Pot liquor, spelled the country way, is the liquid left in the bottom of the pot after you have boiled a mess of greens, collard greens, turnip greens, mustard greens, cooked slow with a piece of ham or a ham bone. Most people then and now cook the greens, eat the greens, and pour that dark liquid down the drain without a second thought. That liquid is the pot liquor. And here is the secret that those old families knew and that we were allowed to forget. That liquid is the single most nutritious part of the entire dish. When you simmer greens for a long time, the vitamins and the minerals, the iron, the vitamin C, the vitamin A, all the goodness that was locked inside those tough leaves, it does not disappear. Much of it cooks right out of the leaves and into the water, so the greens on your plate are only half the nutrition. The other half, the water-soluble half, is sitting in that pot of dark liquid you are about to throw away. Poor families in the South understood this without any laboratory to tell them. They knew that pot liquor cured what ailed you, that it put color back in a sick child's cheeks, that a cup of it was medicine. They sopped it up with cornbread, corn pone, the very argument Huey Long was having, whether you crumble the corn pone into the liquor or dunk it. They fought over how to eat it because eating it was not optional. It was how you survived a winter when meat was scarce and sickness was everywhere. Now here is why this matters to you, in your kitchen, this weekend, and why I saved it for last. This is the easiest thing in the entire video to do, and it costs you nothing extra because you are already throwing the ingredient away. The next time you cook any greens, and I mean any of them, collards, kale, spinach, turnip tops, mustard greens, even the tough outer leaves of a cabbage that you would normally discard, do this. Put them in a pot with just enough water to cook them, add a little salt and, if you have it, a ham bone or a bit of bacon, and simmer them slow, at least 45 minutes, an hour is better. Then, when the greens are done, do not pour off that liquid. Save every drop of it. Drink it warm as a broth. Pour it over cornbread the way they fought about in 1931. Use it as the base for your bean soup instead of plain water. Cook your rice in it instead of in tap water, and watch that rice turn savory and rich and green-flecked and full of everything those leaves gave up. One pot of greens now gives you 2 meals, the greens themselves and the liquor is the one carrying the iron and the vitamins that keep you standing through a hard winter. I did this the first time almost as an experiment, half expecting it to taste like dishwater, and I stood at my sink, drinking a warm mug of collard liquor with a piece of cornbread crumbled in it, and I understood, finally and completely, what my grandmother had been trying to tell me when she said, "Do not pour a single drop down that drain." She was not being fussy. She was handing me a piece of survival that her mother handed to her, that reached all the way back to people who had nothing but a pot, some greens, and the knowledge of what to keep. And I had spent 40 years pouring it away because a magazine told me that was what modern people did. That is the whole thing, really. That is what those Sunday suppers were about, and what we lost, and what you can take back starting right now. It was never about being poor. It was about knowing the true worth of what passed through your hands, refusing to let one bone, one crust, one cup of green water leave your house without giving up everything it had to give. Those men and women at the bottom of the Great Depression were not victims waiting to be rescued. They were the most resourceful people this country ever produced. And every single one of them knew 100 small tricks like the ones I have given you today. Tricks that got quietly buried because somebody figured out they could sell us back our own good sense at a markup. You just took a piece of it back. A whole chicken that feeds you for 5 days. A skillet of poor man's meal for pennies. A pie made from crackers when there is no fruit in the house. $1 of beans made into a feast by $1 bone, and a mug of pot liquor that our own great-grandparents knew was medicine, argued over in an Atlanta newspaper in 1931, and that you will never again pour down the drain. You are the kind of person who always suspected this, I think. The kind who felt in your gut that the old ways were set aside too fast, that somebody profited while real, tested, hand-me-down wisdom got called old-fashioned and shoved in a drawer. If that is you, then you belong here, among the folks who are quietly digging all of it back up. So let me ask you one thing, and I want a real answer down in the comments, because I read them and this is how we teach each other. Which one did your family keep alive? Was it the coffee can of bacon fat by the stove, the Sunday chicken that had to last the week, the vinegar pie, or was it the pot liquor your grandmother would not let you waste? Tell me the dish, tell me who taught it to you, and tell me where they were from. Somebody reading is going to need exactly the thing your family remembered. And if you want to keep recovering what was taken from us, stay close, because this is a room full of people putting the old knowledge back together one method at a time. Next, I am going to show you the trick those same families use to keep butter, eggs, and milk fresh for weeks in the hottest part of summer, with no refrigerator at all, using nothing but a clay pot, a little water, and a shaded windowsill. It sounds impossible. It is not. My grandmother did it every summer, and once you see how simple it is, you are going to wonder, the same way I did, how we ever let ourselves forget. I hope that stirred up some good memories. If it did, let me tell you where this goes next. Everything you just saw was the overview. Inside my membership, the Hard Times Circle, I lay out the whole system, mapped meal by meal. You can ask me your own questions, and a real person answers you myself. And you're not alone in there. You belong. Just point your phone at the code on your screen. Cancel any time.